Greetings tankers and welcome. Here's a new type of video for you, so please give us a like, give us a comment and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date for all future videos just like this, and let us know if you want to see more historical and cool content just like you're about to see. Today we're going to be joined by two guests where we talk about the Sherman versus the T-34. Our first guest is going to be Craig the Tank Hunter Moore.
My link to the Sherman tank is my uncle lost a leg in a Sherman tank on the 8th of August during Operation Totalize. It was the breakout from Com. But I've had an interest in tanks since my school days. But now I write about tanks and for books and also for magazines. I have my own column in Classic Military Vehicles. I get most of my information by visiting all the archives in the UK and abroad, and also inspecting many of the tanks in different museums. When I go there, if you see me there, you'll probably see me with tape measures and protractors measuring angles on tank armour, because lots of the information I found in books is wrong. So I like to test out the information and find new history if I can.
Thank you. And then the second guest, most of you should recognise from the World of Tanks audience, is Richard Cutland.
So recognise sounds ominous, David. I'm Richard Cutland. Yes, so I'm sure some of you recognise me from some of the videos and the content over the years. I do work for Wargaming as the head of military relations. However, in my previous life, I was in the Royal Tank Regiment for 30 years, starting life as a driver, progressing all the way through the trades and rank to finish off my career as a qualified crew tank commander. I've served on numerous operational experiences around the world. I'm also a qualified tank gunnery instructor and also an armoured tactics instructor. So there you go. So my spin on this will probably be more from the crew side of things as opposed to the actual black and white statistical information.
No worries, no worries. And so we'll start it off to Craig Moore. If you could give us a quick intro into your vehicle, the Sherman, and kind of like any key interest or interesting talking points you feel would be important for the audience to know.
Main thing about the Sherman is it's very reliable. It used known technology, and the Americans, when they did the design, they realized it would be used in battlefields and not very far away from the factories. So they made it easy to repair. It was modular. If the tank goes over a mine and the suspension gets broken, they just have to do 16 bolts, take off the bogie and the road wheels and fix a new one. If the final drive and the gearbox needs changing, you unbolt the front and take that off and then fit a new one. It's new design, very, very easy to maintain design, unlike the Germans, where they could recover the vehicles and they could then put them onto a train and take it back to the factory to get fixed.
Okay, thank you. And then for Richard, if you'd like to introduce us to your vehicle, the T-34.
The T-34, for me, the love affair with the T-34 started actually about 6 years ago when I got my first opportunity to physically drive a T-34 in Texas, of all places. A bit more about that later. What can you say about T-34? There's no doubting, of course, the T-34 is a legend in the tank world. Not only the most produced tank of World War II, but also the longest serving. In fact, if you look at the T-34-85, it's in combat in nearly every corner of the globe post-war. However, there's pros and cons to this legendary tank. It does mean, and it makes it a very difficult vehicle to discuss. The reason I say that is because it's surrounded by such a rich history. There are also a number of myths surrounding the T-34. Some of these myths are true, some of them are not true. And also, we also find with the T-34 in particular that many of the combat reports of the period, Second World War, are actually not entirely accurate. The reason for this is there's a lot of stuff that was actually falsely recorded. Now, whether this was because, obviously, like any army, you don't want to appear that you're failing in certain operations, or more likely it was that actually the T-34 and the KV came around being about the same time. So they actually reckoned that a lot of the German troops actually incorrectly identified the KV and the T-34. What else can you say as an introduction to the T-34? Well, I suppose handing over to the man himself, Guderian, the innovator of the Blitzkrieg Blitzkrieg doctrine. He stated the T-34's, and I quote, vast superiority over existing German armour of the period. However, I do already think it's important to note that when he said the period, he was actually referring, of course, to at that stage, the Panzer IIIs and IVs. The birth of the T-34, without going into any great detail about the history of it, it's really an evolutionary response from the Soviets to the Spanish Civil War, of course. In the early 30s, Stalin's deeply concerned about the spread of fascism in Europe, and also, of course, the growing power of both Mussolini and, of course, Hitler. Soviet tank doctrine around that time was very much concerned with maneuverability and reliability in the main. And in 1936 and 37, we see things start to change ever so slightly. And you see a drive to improve armour protection and firepower. Also, really have to mention, as far as its history is concerned, the undeclared war with Japan, which was 38-39. At that time, the Soviet 26s and the BT series were absolutely no match for the superior Type 95s of the Japanese. And every Russian tanker said to a man, we all need a thick armoured vehicle with a powerful gun and a reliable, powerful engine. And the T-34 delivered that to an extent. Soviet tactical doctrine was very much leaned on the approach that the best defence was a good offence, and they relied on overwhelming firepower and sheer weight of numbers in both men and machinery. And so quickly manufacturing the T-34, a relatively straightforward design and a very good fit for what they were after at the time.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the next part of, I think, most people's favorite topic, but not necessarily for everyone, is when it comes to firepower. And I understand these vehicles tended to have a very different approach to how that was done. So I'm not sure who would like to go first and discussing, relatively speaking, their vehicles kind of like main gun armament or any of the intricacies it has, some of the ammo that was used and how maybe it was more unique to the other vehicle.
I'll go on the Sherman. Richard was talking about myths, and there's quite a lot of myths about how bad the Sherman 75mm gun was. That's not quite right. The M3 version of the 75mm gun, when it first came out in the desert, was very, very powerful. It could knock out most of the German Panzer IVs, Panzer IIIs, and all of the Italian armour in the desert area. Just to give you some data from Honeycutt, the firing armour-piercing shells, at 500 yards, it could go through 76 millimetres of armour. At 1,000 yards, it could go through 63 millimetres, and 1,500, it could go through 15 millimetres. The German Panzer IVs in the desert were mainly up to 50 millimetres at the front. They could knock out any of the tanks from the side. So in 1934, when it was being used in the desert, it was a superior vehicle. And most of their guns could not penetrate the frontal armour of the Sherman. Because although the Sherman, you think, it's not got very good armour at the front, just having a look at the Sherman armour, 2 inches, 50 millimetres, that doesn't sound a lot. But it's the effective thickness. The angling of the armour meant that it was, if a shell going straight at a normal angle at the front of the tank, 2 tanks head on, firing at the enemy tank, firing at the front of the Sherman, the angle meant that it was 3.6 inches, which is 91 millimetres. When you think about the Tiger tank, and its vertical armour was 100 millimetres, that means that the Sherman's armour for a shell to penetrate coming from the front was only 10 millimetres shorter than the actual feared Tiger tank. That's not often quoted when talking about armour penetration and the problems with tanks. So the 75mm tank gun, when it first came in the desert and later on in Italy, was successful. In Italy, when it's been used tactically correct, it was knocking out elephants and panthers and tigers when they met them. But the quantity of vehicles that it came across were Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, which the 75mm gun on the Sherman could adequately deal with.
Thank you. And then for Richard's rebuttal.
I suppose, like many tank designs, there are massive variants, and the T-34 was no different to this in history. For reference and discussion ease, obviously, I'm going to just stick to the T-34 76 and the T-34 85. Otherwise, it does make our life extremely complicated. When we talk about the later T-34 85, the more powerful 85mm gun, of course, an upgraded gun, which was given priority really in the wake of the Battle of Kursk. Now, the F-34, the 76.2mm gun, equipped to the initial T-34, through to the beginning of 1944, really, it was able to penetrate any early German tank armour at normal combat ranges. Now, when they were firing what was called the APCR round, which was the armoured piercing composite non-rigid shells, it could pierce 92mm of armour at 500 metres. Now, the best German tanks at the time, as Craig was talking about there, 1941, we're talking, of course, with the Panzer IIIs and the Panzer IVs, and they had no more than 50, 60mm of frontal armour. And also, the F-34 gun had a very adequate high explosive round. Really, then, the development of that, in January 43, the Red Army managed to capture its very first Tiger I near Leningrad. Now, obviously, much like for the Sherman, obviously the Tiger I plays a critical part in significance in the whole discussion for this, really. And the Soviets, not only impressed, of course, by its armour thickness, but, of course, by the actual ability of the very formidable 88mm gun. However, the Soviets, rightly or wrongly, decided to sort of ignore these statistics at that particular time because the Tiger Is at that stage were not deployed in any significant numbers. That really came later in the summer of 43. When all these new German tank types came about, as Craig was talking about, they had thicker armour, began appearing in greater numbers in around late 1942. The T-34's 76.2mm cannon was actually unable to deal with them. And as a result, the T-34 was, of course, upgraded to the T-34 85. This model, with its 85mm ZOS gun, gave it much greater firepower compared to the previous one. And also what it did mean was it could actually penetrate the front of a Tiger I tank between 200 and 500 metres. Now, although it could penetrate it, when you think about the ranges there, 200 to 500 metres is an incredibly short range, and I'm not sure that anybody would have wanted to get that close to a Tiger I. But again, one of these misconceptions we talk about, in my honest opinion, there is no tank that certainly is impenetrable at all, and the Tiger I was no different to that. However, the T-34 85 could only penetrate on the Panther, the non-mantlet part of the Panther turret, at around about 500 metres, meaning that even with the upgraded models of the T-34 85, they usually had to flank a Panther, which is part of their tactical doctrine when they took on Panthers to destroy it, which Craig, I'm sure in his book, has mentioned in great length about that. Sorry, Craig.
When I went to Fort Benning, they've got a cutaway Panther tank. They use it for training the American troops. And one of the beautiful things to illustrate how thick the 80mm Panther tank armour really was is they've got a Sharpie pen and written 138mm. And they put a vertical line going that way because 138mm is thicker than the Tiger I tank's vertical front armour. And so many people don't realise that. It's the sloping of the armour enables you to have thinner armour, so therefore reduces the weight, but it also increases the thickness that a shell has got to penetrate, to go through. But the other thing I found out in doing the archives is that you don't have to penetrate the armour to kill and knock out the tank. The early Panther tanks were subject to trials in the UK, and when it was hit by a shell, it caused spalling. That meant it either fractured or bits of the armour behind went flying into the crew combat area, going bing, 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 at a very high rate, and it would go through the crew members, slice them up, kill them, and the tank is knocked out. The crew is injured, so you don't actually have to penetrate to knock out a tank. And the British found out that the early Panthers, the thickness was brittle, whereas the later ones we don't quite know why, the recipe changed. It was a bit more pliable. So you had to do flanking because none of either the T-34 and the Sherman 75 could not penetrate that type of armor at the front. You'd have to flank, you'd have to go around the sides, and the sides were vulnerable. They were only, on the Panther, it was only 40 millimeters, on the Tiger, it was only 60, and on the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, generally, it was only 30 millimeters. And both the T-34, 76 and 85 gun and the Sherman 75 could penetrate most of the German tanks from the side. And
I think it's, like you say there, Craig, as well, it's also important to note that, I mean, I know we'll get into this topic later, but the training of the crews as well played a massive part as well. The Germans, I read a combat report very recently where the Germans were saying about the T-34, where they noted that they were incredibly slow to fire and engage the targets. Now, there are other things about the sighting systems and the optics, et cetera, as well, but a lot of that is to do with the training as well. And the Germans actually said in this combat report that they reckon they could typically get off 3 rounds for every 1 round fired by the T-34, which I just thought was quite an interesting fact.
Going on to crew training, the only time that I know, there may be others, where the Sherman actually fought the T-34 was in Korea after World War I in the 50s. And there, I managed to look up a few statistics. In Korea, M4A3 Sherman tanks, armed with the 76 millimeter guns, knocked out 24 T-34 85 tanks with North Korean crews for the loss of 7 Shermans. They found on analysis that the 76 millimeter gun had a slightly higher rate of fire because of the better ergonomics inside the Sherman. Crew training and tactical elements like who fired first was very important. A tank in a static defensive position had a better chance of hitting an attacking tank. So the Shermans waiting for the great advance coming from the Chinese and the North Koreans, they were waiting there, they pre-planned the ranges, and they had a better first hit. Based on the available data, Sherman crews in Korea had a better chance of survival than those in the T-34 because of the things like wet stowage of ammunition, individual quick release crew hatches were very important design features, which the T-34 didn't have. Some of the hatches you had to unscrew to be able before you could get the hatch out, which is taking time away. So it was much on the later Sherman tanks. It was a much better designed tank.
And I think you've already reached your conclusion there, Craig. But just talking about the armour, though, we just want to say that obviously the T-34 did and was the most heavily armoured tank in the world at that particular time in 1941. So if you go back to then. I also read quite recently, there's a really interesting report, which I've actually got here, which was called a preliminary report, and it's from the School of Technology in the UK, and it was published in February 1944. The reason I think they're interesting is because, again, when we talk about armour thicknesses, again, myths and that, now obviously we'll come on to it later, but the manufacture of the T-34, many people say it was rough and ready. And that's probably one of the most disparaging things when people talk about with the T-34. However, I just want to quote a quick passage from this report. And it does say in there, and they were looking at armour thickness, armour capability, and that sort of thing. And they were looking at this T-34. And they said, when referring to armour plate hardness, I quote, the rolled armour is of homogeneous quality, but of greater hardness than comparable British quality. The surface finish of the armour is rough when compared with British and American standards, but this gives no indication of its ballistic properties. And it goes on to say that although evidence of hasty welding is apparent, there is no indication of weld failure. And I think that's another one of those myths when it comes to surrounding, the construction of the T-34.
Okay. Any other facts for the Sherman's armour or any interest? Because I know you mentioned already about the effective armour, angling, etc.
One, obviously over a 43, 44, 45, over a 3 to 4 year period, there were design changes. The early ones had faults, which they found out. Like, for example, at the front of the early Shermans, they had direct vision ports for the driver and also for the whole machine gunner. Obviously, they were weak points. You put a shell in there, they would fracture. So that was it. On the next version, they then had a clear glacis plate, and they put periscopes in the top of the hatches. That made them stronger. Later on, they decided to put one solid piece of armour onto the tank. Again, a stronger design, and it was thicker as well. So there were developments. The other problem was weak spots were dealt with by using applique armour. Before they went onto the one piece of metal front, in front of the driver's position, armoured hoods and the whole machine guns, they welded rectangles of armour plate. On the side of the pannier, which is the storage area for the ammunition above the tank tracks, they added applique armour over the stowage areas for the ammunition. And they also found that where on the turrets, where they had to make allowances for the gun sights and other equipment inside the gun turret, it made the armour slightly weaker. So they then put on applique armour on the turret. So these were all new developments that happened during the war to make the tank better.
Okay, thank you. So there was a brief kind of coverage of the armour and the approach that went with them. And I know that this is one particular thing with the Sherman. They mentioned that keeping it to a certain level. Why was the Sherman kind of armour kept as it was, at the level it was? Because you mentioned already it was designed for long off fighting, everything else. Like, was it a particular logistic thing in mind with the armour thickness?
Well, the armour thickness, as I said, the effective thickness was on the 2-inch armour was 91 millimeters, which was quite good. Yes, the sides, like any of the tanks, you flank it, you can penetrate the armour. But the idea was, rather than getting new and heavier tanks, which were being designed at the time, was to get as many tanks out, like with the T-34, as many tanks out as they can to defeat the threat of the German armour. And this is what both the Soviets and the Americans did with their ability, their factory ability of producing tanks at a higher rate than the Germans. And ultimately, it is the ability of the factories to produce war weapons and supplies that won the war, not the battles.
Awesome, thank you. And so the next topic is to do with technology. And I know there's a couple of myths and kind of like stories that are going on with some of the things that were introduced on the T-34 series to kind of help them to be produced en masse, as mentioned, as quickly as possible. But are there any key notes for you that kind of help drive that home?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, David, it's one of the. I'm not saying it's a misconception, because of course it's not. You consider this was a tank that was rolled out in vast quantities as quickly as possible, and also by a country that did not have at that particular time, the technical advantages of someone like, the Americans, the USA, or indeed the British at that particular stage. But I do also think now, when you're looking at anything come off an assembly line, I always use the comparison that, well, let's face it, if you buy a brand new car today, the chances are you're going to have one duffer in a batch of cars that comes off an assembly line. So that's always a comparison I use. And I think that preliminary report by the School of Tank Technology in the UK showed that actually, yes, I totally agree, it was crude to some degrees. Now, you only have to go to any private collector or any museum that owns an example of a T-34, and straight away you will see the weld is not done with, should I say, the finesse, perhaps, of the Sherman. But it works. It does the job. It does exactly what it's supposed to do on the tin. And they proved throughout this report that although everybody was saying, it was bad, the main components were actually quite reliable. And, again, let's not forget the mass and the speed that they were producing these things. As far as the other technology was concerned, yes, of course, there are some downsides, which I think probably were more important. The gun sights and the range finding for the F-34 main gun were incredibly crude, especially if you were to compare them with the German adversaries. And it did affect accuracy, and it did affect the ability to engage at any particular long ranges. It was also, again, we're going back now to the crew configuration, I think, and one of the things that was a bit of a drawback initially on the early T-34 was this two-man crew, turret crew, that is. The vision was particularly bad, and I know from first-hand experience of having driven a few of these now that is very, very true. It is a bugger of a vehicle to see out of. Now, don't get me wrong, any tank, and I include, the Challenger 2, which I last served on to this, it's not easy. However, we've got thermal imaging and everything else that goes with it. The T-34 had none of this. And the Germans were no fools at this particular stage, and they very quickly picked up on the fact that the T-34s had extremely poor and very limited visibility. There was a report that I read about a German commander that noted, he said T-34s operated in a disorganized fashion with little coordination, or else tended to clump together like a hen with its chicks. Individual tank commanders lacked situational awareness due to the poor provision of vision devices and preoccupation with gunnery duties. A tank platoon would seldom be capable of engaging three separate targets, but would tend to focus on a single target selected by the platoon leader. And as a result, of course, of all of this, T-34 platoons lost the greatest firepower of three individually operating tanks. Even today, tank doctrine, you work as a troop of three. So when you identify a target, the main priority is for the gunner of your vehicle to engage that target, while the commander is actually looking around, situational awareness, being aware of everything that's going on around them, and actually looking for the next target to identify and to destroy straight after that. That's something which actually did lack. So visibility, yes, I totally agree, was poor, very, very crude, and the command, they did have extreme poor visibility. You probably see on any film, which is actually quite accurate, whenever you see T-34s lumbering into battle, usually the commander's hatches are open, purely because they actually really couldn't see much at all unless they were. Now, obviously, this is not a great thing to do when you're going into battle with artillery raining down on you, to have your hatch open. And on top of that, of course, we also had the communications issues with the T-34. I'm not selling the T-34 in this particular segment at all, am I? I'm actually giving more ammunition to you, Craig. But of course, in the early days, the radio was fitted to one vehicle, the platoon commander's vehicle. So the other vehicles had no communication at all. I know from first-hand experience, obviously having served in tanks, that how you ever did that with a series of flag signals must have been extremely complicated, extremely difficult, and would make any sort of command throughout the platoon very, very hard indeed.
Okay.
And the Shermans, they had the radios, and most of the crew all had these very nice indirect prism periscopes that were attached into the hatch. So they had reasonable vision, and they could be swiveled around to give 180 degrees, sometimes 360 degrees. So the vision was a lot better, and also tactical awareness. It was a three-man turret from the start off in 1943.
And so would you say that the Sherman introduced any particular kind of technological advantage over the T-34 in any way, or at that period of time that kind of was carried over to further vehicle designs?
The tanks that Richard served on, they have power packs that can be lifted out the back. This started with things like the Sherman. When it was put in design, it was looked at, how can we make things easy to fix? Because we're going to be in the Pacific, we're going to be in Europe, we're going to be away from the factories, as already mentioned. So that was one of the major technological design features of the Sherman tanks, of the American tanks, that was then later transferred to modern day tanks. The engine could be unbolted and lifted out the back on the Shermans. Same with the T-34, but every item was much easier to remove and replace with the Sherman tank. So making logistics easier, you didn't have to have a proper full-grown factory following the tanks up. The field engineers could fix it if they had the right bits.
Awesome, thank you. And now, usually it's not discussed that much, but it was breached already briefly with kind of maneuvering and flanking, and that's the mobility of these vehicles. So which of the two, which do you feel would has the advantage here?
For speed, it's the T-34, because the Although the one we're talking about, the T-34, sorry, the M4A1 Sherman could only do short bursts of 24 miles per hour, its average road speed was 21 miles per hour, which is not very fast. And I'm sure the T-34 could go a lot faster than that.
Yeah, the best average speeds obtained in tests was actually around 55 kilometres per hour, whatever that works out to in miles per hour, 34-ish, I think, 34 miles per hour, something like that.
Close enough.
Close enough. And yeah, I agree that actually for the T-34, it was fantastic. The first time I ever drove it physically, I was gobsmacked, I'll be honest, about how manoeuvrable it was. The T-34-85, the engine, although almost unchanged really since the first T-34 was built, still reliable, still that very sturdy 38-litre water-cooled V234 V12 diesel engine. They decided quite rightly to get rid of the gas engine early on in the production, and it developed quite a healthy 520 horsepower, which was really, really good. Again, I don't really want to, but I'm going to have to mention, though, at this particular point, having driven the T-34 as well, it's got 4 forward and 1 reverse gears, and the steering's by clutch brakes. Now, clutch brakes on any vehicle are an absolute nightmare. And I have to say, without any shadow of doubt, it was one of the most physical, shall we say, tanks that I've ever driven in my life. It was hard work to drive, but incredibly manoeuvrable. And I also think it's worth mentioning as well that the tracks on the T-34 were really good. They had 12, 13 different variations of track on there, but really, really good sort of ground pressure on there. Not much more than your average human foot. And obviously lessons learned from, fighting against the finish, and also obviously on snow, etc., etc. So a really, really good track system on there. And as far as reliability was concerned, again, I'm not saying this is a complete myth, because you can read various reports about, poor reliability, about testing of the vehicles. They took out a batch to test, and out of the 10, 7 failed the initial test, etc., etc. But certainly the ones that they fielded initially were very, very good and very reliable. And all the reports you read from the Russian tank crews, or the Soviet tank crews, are actually speak very highly of it, how easy it was to maintain.
Again, the Shermans were a reliable tank. They used old technology. Unlike the Germans, that, for example, the Panthers that went to the Eastern Front and the early Tigers, a lot of them were lost through maintenance, through mechanical defects. But using old technology, trusted technology in these tanks, not trying to reinvent the wheel, worked. So both of these vehicles, I believe, are reliable and were equal on that issue.
Okay, thank you. And then the final and last topic, I know this is probably one of Richard's favorite parts on this one, and this is kind of like the crew. So what was life like with these vehicles, and kind of like in terms of ease of use, the training required, comfort, kind of like what was it like for crews with these vehicles? Which one of the two would you prefer to kind of be in if you were made to get in one?
Many questions there, David. So let's start off with the 3476, because apparently, like many of the contemporary tanks of that particular time, it had a 2-man turret crew arrangement. I can only appreciate how hard this must have been for the turret crew, as I sort of briefly mentioned earlier. So the tank commander was to aim and fire the gun whilst having to coordinate with other tanks, and potentially he was also, the platoon commander. So an incredible amount of work for one man to particularly do there. And of course, that was to be inferior to the 3-man, the commander, gunner, and loader turret crews of the Panzer IIIs and the Panzer IVs of the time, which allowed, as it was so important, the tank's commander to concentrate solely on his particular job, commanding it and situational awareness. So early in the war, the commander certainly fought a massive disadvantage. We also had the issue with the hatches. You'll see some T-34s had the hatches. Obviously, later on with the T-34-85, and we went to the 3-man turret crew as well, things got a lot better for them there. There was also a bit of a lack of a turret basket. Now, when you've got a rotating floor on the tank, it makes it very difficult. And again, from experience of even modern day vehicles, you have to be incredibly careful where you stand inside the turret of a tank when the tank's traversing, especially if it's powered traverse. Otherwise, you're going to do some serious injury to yourself. And again, many records show of broken ankles, broken legs, etc., carried out by suffered by the crews of the T-34s. We didn't really mention much about ammunition storage as well, but I think it's worth mentioning for the T-34 as well that the ammunition storage was okay. I mean, it wasn't any better and it wasn't any worse, I don't think, than the Sherman, in my particular opinion. Again, I'm very hesitant here to say, it could stow X amount of rounds, blah, blah, blah. I think the book figure is 77 rounds of ammunition for the T-34. But like even in today's modern conflicts, when we go on operations, if you say you can stow 77 rounds, I guarantee you could probably cram in 100 rounds into the turret. That's what you do when you go on an operational tour or a war type situation or like that. So it wasn't a particularly comfortable vehicle, I think is what I'm trying to say on here. There was better, there was worse. However, I still go back to the old adage that it actually absolutely did what it was designed and intended to do. Mm-hmm. There's a very interesting comment by, it was American tank crews, probably M4 Sherman tank crews, that does make it clear that they couldn't understand how the crews of the T-34 could actually operate in such a cramped environment without their fur coats on and everything. So a bit of a change there as what the expectations were of perhaps your Red Army crew as opposed to your American crew.
I was quite shocked when I got in my first T-34-85 at Shrivenham. Now, I'm not ideal tank crew size, so I'm over 6 foot and large. And I was shocked at how much space there was inside the T-34-85, mainly because it hasn't got a turret. But the Sherman, that is also spacious once you get in, but there was a problem with the early designs. They had small hatches. You often hear about large hatch and small hatch Shermans, and these did cause a safety problem for the crews when there was a fire. When the tank was hit, they had to get out quick, and the small hatch Shermans, there were many complaints about them. You had to put your hands up very, very quickly, put your elbows down and get yourself out. This problem was looked at, and the later versions, they had the larger hatches added to the design. And Richard talked about ammunition. There's one of the myths that the Shermans always caught fire, and the bad term Ronson was often referred to them, that which was a post-war term and it's wrongly applied. But all tanks, when hit, especially if the ammunition gets hit, they will burn up, they will catch fire. The German tanks caught fire. It's if you get a shrapnel going through the ammunition, it will fizzle, it will catch fire. The modern tanks have firewalls built into them. On the Abrams, on the Challengers, there's protection for the crew. In the Sherman, the ammunition was by the side of them. There was no protection if one started to fizzle and started to burn up. That was recognised. So they then thought, right, what we'll do is we will have wet storage. And the ammunition was removed from the side panniers down lower near the ground area. And they use antifreeze to put, ethanol glycol antifreeze as a fire suppression system. So it reduced the tank burnout rate from early in 1943 in the desert, which was roughly 60%, down to 15% for tanks fitted with wet storage. Because if a piece of shrapnel hit a bit of ammunition in one of these storage areas, the antifreeze would go in and would try to put out the fire. Even if it didn't put out the fire and the shell exploded, it had given the crew added seconds to help them get out of the tank before it went off. So that was a really good development. New hatches, larger hatches, enabling the crews to get out faster, and also this wet ammunition storage facility, which was then carried on post-war to many other tank designs. So later tanks were better than the earlier tanks for the crews. But it was new technology, lessons learned from combat experience.
Awesome, thank you. And so that was the last topic to cover. We want to try and keep it a little bit shorter than going too far. But I do want to give you a chance, Craig, to kind of like give people a chance to kind of see more of your information and work and knowledge around. If you'd like to give us any book titles or stuff.
I'm very, very prolific on Facebook. Just look for Craig Moore. And I've also got a World War One group. But I go to Amazon and look up Craig Moore for the books. I've written about World War One tank guide, how to kill a Panther tank. And that's the British scientific exploration on how to give crews the information they needed when they went to D-Day. How to kill a Tiger tank is coming out soon. I've just done a walk around on all they're called American Panther tanks. That's all the tanks in Fort Benning and also at the American Heritage Museum just outside Boston. And I've got other tank books coming along. So if you're interested in tanks, please have a look out for those.
Awesome. Thank you. And any final words from you, Richard?
So you're not going to ask us which we choose. I'm glad about that, actually.
That's next.
Just a final thing, David, please, for everybody out there, please support us with our podcast, Tank Nuts. Have a look at it. It's on various sites, including Apple, of course. My last guest was the fantastic Stefan Karlsson from the Arsenal and the Swedish Tank Museum. So please support us on there. Give us a review. Thanks very much.
Yeah, after hearing all of that, we're going to rely on you guys to choose the tank that you have there. We've had some pretty good stories on that. I did find out something I didn't know before about T-34s and M4s actually fighting against one another. That was a new one from me, so I hope you've learned something new. Thank you very much all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, David. Thank you, Craig.